All right, welcome to this Q&A. Again, want to welcome to this Q&A. Question came in, and whatever we've spoken about this before, but we'll hit it. We spoke, I think we spoke last week about the Holocaust and if souls and people died during the Holocaust, were they reincarnated souls? But the question that comes up. Before we speak about the Holocaust, we'll mention people. Well, I don't know, I guess a similar topic. Similar topic. So, people, let's say, that rebel against God. Yeah, they go against what God says, right? They go against what God says. But let's say they go through hardship, they go through illness. Yeah. So there are different things here. We got physical illness, you have mental illness. Now, let's make very clear mental illness, depending on what it is, right? Or physical limitations. Yeah, let's say someone has, I don't know, Down syndrome. They have cerebral palsy. They have other things, right? If they're mentally challenged, then whatever they can do, they can do. But they're not looked at the same in God's eyes, quote unquote, as a normal person. They're not going to have the same obligations. We mentioned before, a lot of times that a person's born in a messed up body has to do with reincarnation. But then that we've spoken about, because it's not a punishment for the child, obviously, or really for the parents, because the child's not guilty, right? You have to be guilty at the age of 12 in a day for a girl, 13 a day for a boy, or up until the age of 20. So it can't be a punishment for the child. Obviously, something else going on over here. It's a punishment for the soul. Now, so if a person's mentally challenged, right, they're limited. If they have the IQ of a 5-year-old, let's say, what's a 5-year-old obligated? A parent has an obligation. Parent has an obligation to educate them. Okay. But really, they do things wrong, this and that. Are they liable? Not really liable, right? They're a kid, right? I mean, a parent has an obligation to educate them to the best of their ability. Okay. Now, so you have someone that's got that IQ. God's not looking at them and say, "Oh, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that better? Why don't..." They're mentally challenged. They don't have the same obligations. You have to train them, at some level, in Torah mitzvahs, but they're going to be looked at as totally different. That's if they're mentally challenged. Now, what are they physical handicaps? Physical handicap, maybe they're also limited in certain things that they do, but let's say mentally, they don't have any issues. Yeah. So, they may have, that type of person should have the same obligations. What do you do if they can't? They have trouble walking. They have to walk. Let's say it's a guy, he has to get to synagogue. Yeah, he go in a wheelchair, or someone push him, or whatever. Okay, but again, it's not an issue of mental capacity. Now, the question is going to be, someone who's got mental illness. If they have mental illness, now it's interesting when it comes to conversion. I knew of a case, actually a case here. The person, there was a doubt whether they were Jewish or not. But the person, had been religious for, I don't know, for decades. But the person has mental issues. Definitely has mental issues. Now, if they're on the medication, right? If they're on their medication, then they're like everybody else. Right? They're normal. Right? Seemingly normal. If they're off their medication, or there's something, some issue, whatever, with their medication, then they're off the rails, right? Then, they think they can walk on water or other things. Whatever, it's a serious mental issue. If they're on their medication, very good. Yeah, so the question was, what do you do with such a person? In other words, how can they convert? You see, a lot of the time they're with it, very good. So I asked my Rabbi this question. He said that he's probably Jewish, which most likely he was, but there were some issues with it, but he said when the person is lucid, then you take him to base it. Then you take him to convert, right? The process is a lot easier, a lot quicker. But basically, you take him to base them when he's lucid. Yeah, because it's already been this way for so many years, right? He's keeping Torah and mitzvahs. Okay, so what do? You want to clarify it. You want to make sure there are no doubts over here. So when the person's lucid, that's what they did. When the person was lucid, they set up an appointment with the base. Then they converted him, right? You had to go through conversion. Now, can somebody, this comes up, can someone, like who's bipolar, can they convert? Can they be religious? Why not? Why not? They're under proper guidance. They, proper medication. They are, they're seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist. They're under guidance. Very good. What if, what if they have more severe, issues? So if a person has more severe issues, let's say they have, psychosis, they have schizophrenia. Schizophrenia can also be, it can also be dealt with. It's a combination of, definitely therapy and medication. I mean, definitely medication. And, sometimes the medication's off, whatever. But even with schizophrenia, a person is under the right care and the right medication, why couldn't they lead a religious life? Why couldn't they be, why couldn't they convert? Now, the question really is, which is hard to say, but the question is, what if they have mental illness? Now, it depends. It depends what the mental illness is. What if someone, let's say, again, I'm not a psychologist, I didn't play one on TV. You can take this with a grain of salt, but let's say someone suffers from serious depression. They're manic depressed. So you need two things. You need medication, probably a lot of medication, and therapy. Now, is it possible for someone to function? If they're manic depressive, it's gonna take effort. It's gonna take a lot of effort. When they're suffering, they can't really function. God, I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. God's gonna say, well, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, you should be working on this, working on that. They have issues. Serious issues. No one's gonna argue that. Right? So we're gonna get punished for that. That's serious mental illness. Now, let's say it's under control. You can have lapses, this, that, but let's say it's under control. Then they're like everybody else. And God's going to judge them, what they think, how they do, their actions, very good, right? So it's going to depend. It's going to depend on the mental illness itself. Can't say across the board, wow, person has mental illness, God's giving him a free pass. Depends. It depends what level the mental illness is. It depends how severe it is. Does that mean a person can't convert? No. Does that mean a person cannot keep Torah mitzvahs? No, doesn't mean that. But it depends. It depends. If they're under proper guidance, under proper medication, they're being watched, all things being equal, why not? But a person can say, we don't want people like that in our community. Probably have enough as it is. Why should we let someone in if they suffer from these issues? Okay, it's a fair point. But if they meet the criteria, and let's say they're under control for the most part, right? I know someone's bipolar, that, they became, religious. They were, born Jews. They were secular, became religious. They function just fine. Yeah, they have psychiatrists, psychologists they're in contact with. They're on medication. Haven't had any episodes, at least not that I know of. So, why not? What's the problem? If it's controllable. And the time that it's not controllable. Let's say let's say they didn't take their medication. Let's say. And they're like, they go off the rails. At that point, once they're off the rails, so to speak, in my language, they are not, God's not going to look at them and say, oh, they did this, they did that, they did the other thing, right? They did the other thing. They're off the rails, right? They're off the rails, they're not going to get punished, right? And, why why should they get punished? Why in the world should they get punished? Yeah. It doesn't make any, it doesn't make any sense, at all. Um, why that should be. Because the reality is, if there's nobody home, if there's nobody home, then how can you expect anything? I mean, God's not, not that big of a ogre, so to speak, that God's going to do that. In other words, they're not in the right mind. If they're not in their right mind, how can they be liable? When they're in their right mind, okay, it's a different issue. But a person can't say, well, if they have mental illness, God's going to give them a free pass. Who says? Depends what it is. 100% it depends what it is. If it's something they can be in control of, it's one thing. If it's something they're not in control of, they're out of whack, they're going to be exempt. They're going to be looked at as they're mentally challenged at that point. Now, this comes to the second question. Second question is let's say someone goes through serious health issues, right? Or let's say they go through the issue of they went through the Holocaust, right? Let's say they went through the Holocaust. Now, anyone who went through the Holocaust, there are not too many of them still alive, but anyone who went through the Holocaust and their emunah is intact. One of the great rabbis once said, coming to me for a blessing, why come to me? See this person with a tattoo, go ask him. His emunah, his faith and belief in God are unbelievable strong, even though they came through the Holocaust. So, right. So so the claim was, God's not going to judge them. Because even though, let's say they went off the rails. They saw the family killed in front of them. We can't judge them. Right? It's a rebellion against God, for sure. Nothing to talk about, but what they went through. Right? Now, even if we don't come on to the fact that maybe they were reincarnated souls or whatever, they died. They died for the sake that they were Jews. Because they should have a high place in the world to come. But let's say, that was my answer. God will judge them. How is he going to judge them? Can't answer. What's an ultimate rebellion against God? Okay. Well, look at the hardship they went through. Good. You're right. Right? I'm not here to judge. Right? It's not for me. It's not for me to say, well, they really deserve to be punished. Look what they've done. They spit in God's face, but look what happened to them. Look what happened in their lives. Their lives are destroyed overnight. Yeah. So, not for me to judge. Yeah, and certainly not, rabbis this generation to judge. Or even previous generations. Yeah, we don't know. We don't know how God's going to look at it. I would say someone, let's say, they didn't go through that. They suffer from illness. Now, let's say they suffer from illness and they're in pain. Their body's racked in pain. Let's say. They're always in pain, constant pain. Yeah, or other things, I don't know. Whatever illness they have. Let's say, God forbid, get diagnosed with cancer. Now, let's say it's curable, but now, went through chemotherapy, made them very weak, lost all their hair, whatever, they start to come back, but they're bitter. What happened to me? What happened this way? They say life isn't fair. And they blaspheme against God. Let's say they leave, they leave religious observance or whatever. Whatever the case is. Again, it's not for me to judge. But at the end of the day, it is a rebellion, for sure. They're questioning, why did God do this? Now, not for us to question. First, It's not for us to question. I've mentioned this, many times, probably ad nauseum. My class on ethics of our fathers, Pirkei Avos, right? Why is the person, looking at what other people have and say, "Oh, I don't have this, I don't have that. It's not fair." Or even without that, they say what I'm going through isn't fair compared to what other people have. Why should I get sick, brother, and relatively healthy? Why should you get sick overnight? Why should other things happen? Why should their money be stolen? Why should, they have issues with their kids? All kinds of things. We could ask the question. Is there any difference? I mean, seriously, is there any difference? Going through hardship. Any hardship. Couldn't we say life isn't fair? Couldn't we say I deserve better? Couldn't we say, blasphemy against God, say I'm not going to keep mitzvahs anymore? I'm not going to do anything anymore. Look at what I'm going through. So what does that have to do with if it's an illness? It could be anything. Well, person lost all their money. Good example. Yeah. Or they got ratted on, something happened, whatever. They could ask the question. They say it's not fair. Why'd you have to go through that? You come to Torah mitzvahs, you help a lot of people, and boom, gets taken away above nature. Kind of harsh. Okay. That mean you're going to complain? You're not thankful for all the goodness you had before? You lose all your mitzvahs if you say that. If you say it wasn't worth it. You lose everything. So, don't we go through all kinds of hardship? Sure. Now, person singled out physical pain. Either sick, their body's sick. Now, could that make them bitter? People suffer from mental illness. Could also be bitter. Because life is being just horrific. What's the difference? They say, okay, mental illness maybe, they're not in the right mind. They don't see things straight. Okay, but let's say, we'll talk about illness. Your mind's there. Right? We're not talking about a person that's dementia. The mind's there. The body's just acting up in different ways. Now, again, you can't judge anyone unless you've been in their shoes, right? But at the end of the day, what's the difference between that and financial misfortune? What's the difference between that and, I don't know, strong family issues? What's the difference? You say, no, this is different because, a person's racked in pain. And a person's suffering. Oh, you're not suffering the other way? Someone tells you to your face, you're an embarrassment scenes with someone. What's worse? You'll say physical illness is worse. Okay, maybe. But that's kind of hard to take. Is it being ostracized kind of hard to take? You can say, I want to show them, I want to have a connection, and they spit you out. Isn't that kind of hard? It's hard. So where do you draw the line? See, it's very good. It's very easy to speak in generalities about things you don't know about. You make a generality. Oh, I think this, that, and the other thing. Yeah, and you're making a generality about something that you're not clarifying. You're not clarifying. Well, I think this because of this. That's not an answer. Yeah, you got to back it up. Why? Oh, yeah. These scholars say that. Well, I don't care what any scholars say. Well, what is it? How do you define it? Anyone, make a statement. Anyone with mental illness, God's going to give a free pass. Yeah, they're not going to suffer. Right? They're not going to suffer because they have mental illness. That's a statement. That's a true statement. You didn't define anything. If they have mental illness and they're under control, God's going to give them a free pass. They see psychiatrists, they see psychologists, they're on medication. Yeah. You wouldn't know the difference. You wouldn't know the difference. They're bipolar, let's say. God's going to give them a free pass? And God's going to say they're not liable for anything? Come on. You got to give definitions. So people in the Holocaust can't say. We can't say. Is it an absolute rebellion against God? Sure. What they suffered. Now, is that suffering? Are we going to compare that type of suffering to illness? And say, okay, I had enough. My body's racked in pain. I can't function, this, that. I'm done. Is that the same thing? I mean, maybe you're nitpicking there. Maybe. But you have to look at each thing in and of itself. You can't make comparisons. You know what happens when you compare, right? Or let's say better, when you make assumptions, right? I won't go further than that. When you make assumptions, you make assumptions, yeah? But that doesn't mean it's true. That doesn't mean it's true. That's why the rabbis make very clear, ain't doing the milsa a milsa. You cannot compare like things, because maybe they're not the same. Maybe the circumstances are different. I was just learning something today, earlier, and something looks similar. One of the commentators, oh, why did you say like this before? Right? Seemingly it's the same case. I said, no. Why isn't it the same case? Because different factors. There are different factors involved. Okay. But it looks similar. Anyone from the outside says, yeah, the similar cases. Okay, let's break it down. Let's see. Is it really similar? And how similar? So, we'll throw out the $1 million question. Is all mental illness the same? Hell no. It's definitely not the same. Some are better, some are worse. Okay, but they're not all the same. Not all mental illness created equal. It's not the same. You can't make a blanket statement like that. So that's one thing about mental illness. Okay. The Holocaust is a whole nother beast. It's a whole nother beast. The Holocaust, the same thing as someone suffering from physical ailments, physical pain. Is that the same thing? Right? Now, what type of physical pain are you talking about? What level of not being able to function are we talking about? And a person can't function because, what do you do? A person gets migraines. A person gets a migraine, they're out of commission for hours. For hours. Let's say it's a guy, he's got an obligation to pray. He's going to be exempt over here. He's sick. Can't get out of bed. Yeah, he can't move. Could be, take some medication, maybe a few hours later feel a little bit better, this, that. But if they feel like, like a piece of dirt, they can't really move, they don't feel so much better, they're going to sleep the rest of the night or whatever, they're not going to pray, okay, they're exempt. They're sick. But it depends on the case. Technically, again, someone went through the Holocaust, isn't that a rebellion against God if they go against Torah and mitzvahs? If they were religious before, sure, that's what it is. Yeah, well, look what they went through. So I would agree. Maybe they should get a free pass. Yeah. If they don't end up religious, if they don't stay religious, it's not for us to judge. Yeah, that was my answer. It's not for us. Something like that, we can't judge. We have no power to judge. If we'd gone through the same thing, you can say something. If you haven't gone through the same thing, this is God's code. But again, you want to pin me down. Is it a rebellion or not? It's a rebellion. 100% it's a rebellion. Every time you do a transgression, it's a rebellion against God. So I asked my Rabbi this question. I said, I could have someone at my Shabbos table, certain people, my Shabbos table for the next 20 years. If they live that long, they'll never change. I said, isn't that a rebellion against God? And he said, it's taiva. It's desire. Technically, it's a rebellion. Every sin is considered a rebellion. Yeah, but it depends why you're doing it. Yeah. But if it's, he said straight away, it's no. He said it's desire. They don't know anything, whatever, it's desire. They're going on base desire. It's not the same thing. But again, break it down, technically speaking. Isn't that a rebellion? Sure. The rebellion. Do they know, do they know their elbow from their elbow? Whatever. They don't know nothing. What was the important question they've ever asked? I put ketchup, mustard, or relish on my hot dog. Okay. But they're holding nowhere in the world. Absolutely nowhere in the world. So yeah, technically it's a rebellion. Chaim Briscoe once said, someone doesn't know anything. Yeah, someone doesn't know anything is a heretic. It's not because. Yeah, why is he Tinok Shanish? But someone who, grew up as a potato farmer in Idaho, no offense. Anyone's a potato farmer, grew up in Idaho. Someone grew up knowing nothing. Yeah, Tinok Shanish, but okay. But over here, he's still not because. He's still a heretic, he's just a nebuch. How do you translate nebuch? I don't know. It's like, that's what he is. He's going to be a heretic anyway, even if he doesn't know anything. It's tragic. Even if he doesn't know anything, he's still a heretic. That didn't change anything. Did not change anything. Yeah. Yeah. So if it doesn't change anything, then what would I say? Yeah, it's a rebellion to a point. But, God's going to have, judge it however he's going to judge it. That's on our call. Now, you could say, just on the flip side, if a person's going through serious illness, if they go through serious illness and they can't take it anymore. Now, let's say they know it's terminal. It's just a matter of time. So let's say they take a pill and, and they end it. Is that suicide? There's a difference of opinion, right? There are two opinions. Yeah. If a person did this, Jew or non-Jew, for that matter, won't discriminate, right? What happens? They don't want to suffer. They don't want to go through suffering. So they end it. So technically speaking, that's not called suicide. But suicide is a severe prohibition here. Very severe prohibition. For Jews and non-Jews. For a Jew, it means you don't get buried in a Jewish cemetery. There are no mourning customs. You don't get up at resurrection of the dead. But there's one other factor. And that is most people who end it are not in their right minds. Right? It's part of a mental illness. And therefore, it's a severe prohibition, but what I said doesn't apply. For that reason. So again, these are hard things to judge. These are definitely hard things. And the bigger things, yeah, God's going to judge it. However he judges it. But not every case is going to be the same. And not only that, the question is, what can people handle? That's also a question. If someone can, tolerate a lot more and they don't, they can be liable. If someone, can't, okay, it's a different issue. Yeah, but God's going to look at each individual issue. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Not just, you got mental illness, you're exempt. Who says? Depends on what it is. Depends how severe it is. Depends if it's constant. Depends if if it keeps coming back or not, or what level. Yeah, the Holocaust is a whole different thing. Holocaust is a whole different thing. That's not, it's a moot point. It's a moot point. They suffer tremendously, no question. Right? Right? So the issue is, someone will say they get a free pass. Probably. That would be my guess. Yeah, they died because they're Jews. They weren't given a choice. They died because they were Jews. So that should give them a free pass. Should. Will it? If hold like Ravad Yosef, they were souls that sinned during the Second Temple period, let's say. And they were reincarnated, that's it, they're done. They got their portion of the world to come. Yeah, they got their free pass. Yeah, the ones that died. Yeah, the ones that were killed. The ones that went off, God will judge it. I mean, it's not for us to judge. Not for us to judge. Someone says, okay, yeah, let's take some, I can't imagine after all that, there are going to be any questions here. One second. PTSD. Post-traumatic traumatic brain injury. Okay. From military service. Good. Therapy is seldom. Very good. Okay. One with lots of judgment, emotion. Yeah. Somebody like that, yeah, God will probably treat them with kid gloves. It's an illness. Now, the times that they're lucid and, they're doing what they need to do, they'll be judged accordingly. But let's say, because of the traumatic brain, injury, they look like they have mental illness. Now, again, at what level? Depends how bad it is. There are people, yeah, they go to therapy. Maybe as you're saying, maybe it's not so much therapy. Okay, even so, even if that would be the case, yeah, some people, most likely, they don't all get the same. Some people probably have more severe case of it. If you have a more severe case of it, let's say, and probably majority of the time, you're not going to be judged for that. Lapse of judgment, other things. You're not going to be judged for that because your brain doesn't work properly. That is a proper mental illness, right? Again, if it's under control and there's medication and they're seeing the therapist, and, again, depends what level they're at. And it depends what they do. But again, that's part of mental illness. Again, it doesn't necessarily give them a free pass totally, but probably, I would say, a good chunk of it, they probably have a free pass. Probably. Because they have serious brain injury. What can you expect? Yeah. So I'll tell you a story. I see someone, get wheeled in every couple of days to learn for a number of hours. Person got COVID and like totally like it should have been dead. Literally should have been dead. Yeah. He's got brain injury. What can he does the best he can. Yeah. He tries to learn, tries to keep what he needs to keep and whatever. But he's limited. Someone who's limited, God can't, it wouldn't be fair. God's gonna say you're obligated and all these things. I made you brain injured. Okay. I made you that, this happened to you. Okay. God's gonna punish him for that? Doesn't make any sense. Whatever they're capable of doing. The bottom line is if they're capable of doing more, let's say, and they don't, is God really going to hold it against them because they're in a much weaker state? It's very hard to say. Very, very hard to say. If you pin me down, I would say no. I'd probably say no. But, whatever, God does it. Again, it depends how bad it is. It depends what they do also. But it shouldn't matter because if it's caused by brain injury, they shouldn't be liable. Right? For a number of things, they should not be liable. Right? So, if, when they're okay, they're doing the right thing and going the right path, good. So they're like everybody else. But the time's not like that, and it's caused because of brain injury, I can't imagine it's a negative punishment here. Why should it be? They're not capable. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's traumatic brain injury. Right? How can God say, well, it's too bad. I'm gonna punish you severely anyway because your brain's messed up. Well, God made it messed up that way. It won't make any sense. Right? It's gonna cut a lot of slack because they're not capable. If someone's not capable, he can't be liable. Right? Just through pure logic. Supposed to get migraines, yeah, we can't eat. Okay, midday muscle spasms. Ooh, huh? Yeah, something, again, something like that. Something like that, you're out of commission. Right? 100% you're out of commission. Yeah, I remember when I was younger, I got like a sinus infection. It was so unbearable. I mean, okay, I was a kid at the time, but I can imagine if I got it, older. Like any type of sunlight, burn. It would like burn my whole head. Right? Sinus totally inflamed. Inflamed. Anyone that had a sinus infection, they know what I'm talking about. It was at that point, you're out of commission for hours. Yeah, you can't be expected to do anything. You're sick. What do you do? I had 3 days last, 3 days last year. I couldn't get out of bed. Could not physically get out of bed. Fainted a number of times, whatever, like a nasty, nasty virus. God's going to say, oh, you should have got up and prayed. It wasn't possible. Totally not impossible. No, sorry, not possible. Couldn't stand up for goodness sakes. God's going to say you're liable to pray when you're flat in your back? No, you're exempt. 100% you're exempt. You're sick. God can't expect a sick person to pray or do anything else for that matter. You know, you're out of commission, you're out of commission. Right? That's it. Nothing else to say. You know, again, if a person's in pain, depends what level of pain, depends what level they can function. So again, it's not a one shot, one size fits all, right? Over here. Yeah, I know. Whatever. I know people that get migraines. Yeah, medication doesn't necessarily work, right? Yeah, it's a weird thing. But they can't function. You know, remember being somewhere and the person's spouse was they weren't there. Understood. They're out of commission. They are out. Like, well, what can God expect when you're out of commission? Nothing. Nothing. Um, you totally be exempt. It wouldn't make sense otherwise. Then you're going to ask the question. Then you're going to ask the question. When bad things, happen to good people, like why does this happen? And what can you do? Like if you're out of commission, you're out of commission. You know, person, God cannot expect a person if they're out of commission that they're supposed to be at the highest level and be doing other things. You can't. If it's something you can and you can withstand and whatever, okay, right? But that's I'm talking about a case where it's not the case. And even if you have, let's say someone who's mentally challenged, someone who's a kid who's mentally challenged, let's say. So they're totally limited what they can do. But you still have to try and train them in mitzvahs. You still have to try and, give them good character traits, work on different things, but they're totally limited. Totally limited. So if they're totally limited, they cannot have the same obligation. They can never have the same obligation because they're limited. Right? Now, again, it depends on the limitation. It depends what it is. It depends how it affects them. Some people can be, normal in the mind and body takes over. And they're just, they have all kinds of physical ailments. Yeah. God can't expect the same things, from them that someone who's, totally healthy doesn't have issues. It depends what they can overcome. It depends what they do. Well, if someone's racked with pain, let's say, someone's racked with pain, then what? They can't function. We live in a cream puff generation, and a person go through serious pain. And what's the first thing they're going to say? Take it away, because they don't want to go through the pain. Any level of pain, right? Now, just on that topic, there are people, in general, not even talking about necessarily physical pain, will do whatever they can not to feel any pain in life. Yeah, they want everything easy. They don't want to have any hardship. So they don't want to go, you know what suffering is in this world, the Gemara says? Gemara says you put your hand in your pocket and you take out the wrong coin. It's also suffering. You think, come on, it's not the same suffering as like other things. Gemara calls it suffering. It's also part of suffering. But see, in this world, this cream puff generation, no one wants to suffer for anything. They go to a store, in summertime, it better be air conditioned. Car air conditioning better work. Nobody wants to suffer. In anything. Any little thing, for some people, drive them crazy. I remember once someone was buying me, and there was a light bulb in a room that was out. Now, it doesn't mean there wasn't any light. There was light there. Like, aren't you going to fix it? I was like, yeah, I don't have any spare light bulbs, whatever. I'll get to it. Aren't you going to fix it? I'm going to do something? I'll get to it. That my ultimate priority. I'll get to it. Yeah, I was, I had other things to do. I was about to run out to a store to get a light bulb. Maybe I should have. Okay. But do something, fix it, do it. So that means that person is very hypersensitive. And any little thing doesn't go the right way, they go crazy. There are people like that. They go absolutely crazy. Yeah, house has to be in a certain order. This has to be in a certain order. Like any little thing that veers off the path, they're like, they don't know what to do. And sometimes, sometimes it's very hard not to laugh. I'm like, are you serious? It's like, I can understand, like, a person doesn't like to see dishes in the sink. Yeah, you don't want to get flies, other things. Okay. Yeah, okay. So yeah, they should be taken care of. Okay, you didn't get to it yet, whatever. Okay, you gotta spend time, whatever. If certain things bother people, good. Well, there are a lot of stupid things bother people. You know, I've noticed. You ever notice, like, someone's on their phone, the app doesn't work, or something they need, like, you get aggravated. Figure, I need this. I was once, whatever, for a number of years, I sent out a newsletter for an organization, and when I went to, when I was working on it, all of a sudden I lost all my fonts. I'm like, I looked at the memory, this and that, the fonts are there. For whatever reason, there was, I don't know, a hide button or whatever. I made them disappear. I'm not gonna tell you how long it took me to figure out how to get them back. But eventually I got them back. But yeah, isn't that kind of aggravating? Where are my fonts? What do you do with my fonts? Give my fonts back. You did it to yourself. It's stupid. Okay. Yeah, well, like, things you need today, yesterday, whatever, and then you can't bring it up. You don't know where it is. Like, it's in the memory somewhere. You put it under a name, you forgot where you put it. Okay, like, these are minor things. Minor things. That's also part of suffering. Yeah, not as major as other things. Yeah, but, it's also part of the process here. You can have patience. Yeah, and again, these things throw us off because we need it. And we are so focused, on technology that any little thing goes wrong. Like, what do you mean I can't get this app on? What do you mean this won't download? What do you mean that, like, what do you mean the server's down? Like, 5 minutes, something goes wrong. People are like, how am I gonna know anything's gonna go on? No one's gonna be able to call me. This, that. Or even better, person lost their phone. People go crazy, they lose their phone. Now they have like trackers and different things. Okay, but like person can misplace their phone. And you feel like you're helpless. You can't call anybody, no one can call you, you're missing information. Like you feel totally helpless because you got everything there. I mean, these are real things. I mean, kind of stupid also, but this is the real thing. Anyone's ever lost their phone, they know. They know what it feels like. They feel like, it's like I don't have anything. Feel like, even that you like I had everything taken away. It's similar here. A lot of people take buses, so you have to have your bus, but you have to know where your bus pass is, like at all times. You have to know where it is. So like sometimes like, oh, all right, where is it? Where did I put it? Where is, it's aggravating because you don't want to go anywhere. You don't, you go on the bus, you don't pay, it's stealing. Right. So, maybe you have to use, you have to borrow someone else's car, whatever. It's aggravating, but you have to be on, you have to be on top of things. Yeah, this is what we worry about today. I'm not saying these are the bigger things, but it's part of life. Yeah, well, certainly here, it's part of life. When a person misplaced their phone, ooh, people go out of their minds. They go out of, I understand why. I'm not downplaying it. I understand why. I understand why. But, some people just like go out of their minds because that's their life. Everything's there. All their banking stuff, all their, all their other, other information and what they use it for and whatever. Technology can be a great thing and it can also destroy us. Because we're so subservient to it. We're so subservient to screens, also for the most part. But like, yeah, something gets lost. Imagine someone needs glasses. Can't they? Where did I put my glasses? Right. Remember, someone's looking for the glasses. They were on top of his head. I was like, no, they're still on your head. They're like, oh, I thought I moved them. But it's aggravating. You need something, you need it now, and you can't find it. And there's nothing, in our lives, God's probably looking down on like these stupid people. Look at this generation. Look how backwards this generation is. But it is what it is. Yeah, it's an important thing. I'm not saying not. People want to. know exactly where their phone is, and they should know where the phone is. But like the importance that it's given and the effect on your life is is unbelievable. Is or you take something like information. You don't want to lose. You did all these things and you back it up. Or you're running out of space on let's say on your computer. So what am I going to get rid of? You got to get an external drive, this, that, but you need something, you don't know where it is. That's part of suffering. In the bigger scheme of things, that's part of suffering. And you can't find it, what you do with it. Is it the same as like someone has, physical ailment or something? No, it's not the same, but it's considered part of suffering. Remember, as the Gemara says, if I stick my hand in my pocket, and I pull out the wrong coin, that's also part of suffering. So my Rabbi would say, tongue in cheek, he says, having money is not everything. He says, definitely not everything. But he says every once in a while, it's good to have in your pocket. That is, it's, there's what to be said. I know somebody probably still they have seizures. I wouldn't say like, they faint from them, per se, but like, once, twice a day or whatever, and that's what they live with. But again, they function normal, pretty much. They definitely function normal, otherwise. Now, if they're out they're not usually out for that long, but if they're out for a certain amount of time, they're in a seizure, they're exempt from everything, everything. Because they don't have the capacity. Yeah, we should all have health, right? Give a blessing. Everyone should have health. Everyone should have good health. And, we shouldn't have to go through these things, right? In general, mental health, physical health, being mentally healthy today is not so easy either. Just see all kinds of craziness, all kinds of craziness in the world. That's why probably a lot of people on Prozac smiling a lot. Right? Life is hard. Life is complex. Every generation has it. Whatever it is that they have the complexity in, it's whatever. We're not living an easy time. I always say anyone can stay religious today, no matter how many years they're religious, and they stay religious. A big nice, big miracle, big miracle. Because everything was thrown at us. It's just it's hard. Definitely. It's definitely hard. Yeah, let me see the other. So there are other questions here. It comes to these type of things. These type of things. We take a lot of things for granted. That's one thing you got to keep in mind. We take a lot of things for granted, and we only take them for granted. We only take them for granted when we don't have them. Certainly one of them is health. I don't think there's any question. One of them is definitely health. We shouldn't wait till we're sick to appreciate the health we have. Yeah, even everything works. Whatever. More or less. Yeah, tremendously thankful. Should be tremendously thankful for that. Because again, what are the guarantees of life? Death and taxes, right? Not necessarily in that order. So even if things hurt a little bit, whatever, but we still function all right. So we should be thankful for that. Problem is, we complain a lot. We definitely complain a lot, and we want life to be easy. We want life to be smooth, right? The Ramchal says in Paths of the Just, and he says in the Way of God, he says very clear, we're in this world to toil. That's what we're here for. That's exactly what we're here for. Sometimes easier, sometimes not. Very good. Yeah, whatever it may be. But that's what we're here for. They say, well, it doesn't have to be that hard. Well, it doesn't have to be this. Okay, but we're not calling the shots. We are not calling the shots. If God wanted, he can make life much worse. Nobody wants it. Nobody's interested. So we got to be thankful for what we have. Again, Question is, how God's going to look at all this, and look at our reactions and everything else. That's going to be the question. But again, where does God judge someone? Where we're holding. Not, not what we're, not past, present, not past and future. He's looking where you're holding now. He's looking at the generation you're living in now, right? He plays all this into it, puts all this into effect, right? So he looks at the whole picture. But we also have to look at the whole picture. And a lot of times we look at the glass as half empty and not half full. Again, does that mean a person can't go through trauma? No. Does it mean a person can't have hardship? No. Doesn't mean a person can't have tremendous hardship. Okay. But again, is it all bad? Is it seemingly all bad? Or is there any hope? Nothing's ever so bad. It looks bad. It may be bad. But he gave us the power to fight against it. Gave us tremendous power. Not easy. Not easy when the whole world's against you. It's not easy when family members say it's an embarrassment to be around you. It's not easy when you hear different things and you see different things. True. But that's what makes us grow. Right? That's the power that makes us grow. Very good. Very, very good. So, we have to use it to the best of our ability. And it's not always so easy. There could be very dark days. You don't want to get out of bed. You just don't want to deal with life. You want to shut yourself off from the world. That's normal. That is normal. It's not like, could that be? Could it lead to something to mental illness? It could be. But, does everyone have, every single day they look at it as a great day? They're whistling Dixie and they're doing the jitterbug and they're, doing the moonwalk. I know people still do the moonwalk. I don't think so. There are good days, better days. You have worse days, but even on the worst day, you got to look at the good. You got to see the good. If we would live according, to what Victor Miller says through the Chovos and Vovos, through duties of heart, you never have a bad day. Why? Because everything is good. You just have to know how to look at it. Like someone asked me, I mentioned this last week about the heat. People are going to complain, it's 100 degrees, 35 degrees Celsius, whatever, and it's so hot. So yeah, it's hot. First of all, you're not outside that much, most likely. You're not suffering that much in that sense. But he says, it's such a great thing. Look what it's doing. It's ripening all the apples and the peaches and the plums and, it's doing all this good stuff. But you're looking at it as it's just too hot. It's way too hot. Okay. But there's a benefit for it. But you have to see the bigger picture. Seeing the bigger picture is harder. It's harder whatever you're going through. We go through a lot. We can go through, 70 mood swings more, on a daily basis or an hourly basis. We go up and down all the time. Here, good news, bad news, tragic news, all kinds of things. Yeah, we go up and down like a yo-yo. Person can be happy, ecstatic, and then, come back to earth and who knows what, as well. So, life's not supposed to be easy. That's not what the Torah says. Definitely not supposed to be easy. But I have to know how to navigate it, and I have to know, there's a bigger scheme out there. Even if I'm not necessarily given it, I have to live my life accordingly. Yeah. That's the whole difference. That's a huge difference. Knowing how to live, even when things are, things look bad or really bad, right? And able to see the good. Sometimes very hard. Sometimes it stops people from reaching potential because they feel they're getting beaten down too much in life. And that's what it is. Now that could be. It's a major factor, but that's Moreno Verambeno, the Yetzer Hara. That's what the Yetzer Hara wants. It's all bad and this and that, then yeah, it is. But you got to make the best of it, whatever it is. And again, it's not all bad. It's just our perception. So, as we always say, things that look bad could turn out good, and things that look good could turn out bad. And maybe things that are bad end up bad. Okay. But again, what's the bottom line? You got to put your best foot forward either way. So you got to thank God for everything you have. That's, that changes the person's outlook, and it'll add years to your life also. Yeah. Why would it add years to your life in general? Because you have a positive outlook. People who have a negative outlook, let's say that, they had a serious illness, something happened, their outlook is bad. What most likely will happen to them? Basically, if they give up the will to live, they'll atrophy and they'll die. So I know a couple of cases like this. Actually, it's the same case. Both people had strokes. Yeah, and basically one just gave up the will to live. A few months later, went into hospice, and that was it. Yeah, couldn't play Sudoku. Like that's the criteria to be able to live. Can't even do crossword puzzles. Okay, I'm out. Game over. I'm gonna check out. Someone else, whatever. They want to go through rehabilitation, and basically what happened to them, they also died. Right? But they gave up the will to live. Now, does that mean if you have the will to live, you're gonna live 20 more years? Doesn't mean that. Definitely doesn't mean that. But you definitely will live longer. But it's the way you look at it. The more negative a person, whatever, they'll atrophy. Yeah, that's been proven in science. 100% has been proven in science. So, attitude is everything. But yeah, some days, you hear things or you see things or whatever. Some days it's very hard. It's extremely hard. And it's depressing. But somehow you gotta, try and pull yourself out of it. It might take time. Okay. Again, I'm not saying the person has a mental health issue per se. Right? I'm saying it's necessarily going to lead to that, but this is what happens. This is everyday life. These are things that are common. So it's not like, oh, I feel bad now, whatever. Does that mean I have this issue or that issue? It doesn't necessarily mean that. First of all, I have to feel sad when you're supposed to be sad. You can be happy when you're supposed to be happy. Anger, obviously, got to work on, right? And not letting aggravation get to you, whatever it is. So whatever, person got to be careful. You don't want to go to one extreme or the other. As the Rambam says, you take the middle path. Okay. That's work. Life is work. This generation doesn't want to work. They don't want to work on themselves. Yeah, it's just easy to throw in the towel and just say, no, I'm going to give up. Do something else. Yeah, I'm not going to deal with it. Well, you got to deal with it. They don't want to deal with it. They check out mentally. They check out. I'm saying they have a mental health issue. They just check out. Again, is that common? It's common. All these things are common. The only question is how you look at it. That's the only question. How you look at it, how you deal with it. That's the question. Yeah. Let me see. Any other questions? All right, so no questions. I'm going to stop here. This is every Tuesday and Thursday, 10 o'clock Eastern Time, 5 o'clock Israel time. Anyone has any questions, you can find me on Facebook at Chaim Kaufman, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism, orthodoxconversion.com. Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism on YouTube. There I got videos on Q&As, ethics of our fathers, book of Leviticus. You want to send me an email, RabbiChaimKaufman@gmail.com, RBBIChaimCoffman @gmail.com, whichever good.